Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today, and they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. This week's guest was actually on the show just 2 weeks ago. It is Chris Cook, energy market strategist and senior research fellow at University College London. Now, I asked Chris to come back on the show to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to discuss the economic sanctions that are being put in place, whether or not they'll be effective, how Russia's energy dominance over Europe will impact this war, what can be done, and how we can build markets that will stop this kind of terrible invasion and attack in the future. Now, Chris delves into, during the second half of the episode, the theory of markets that he touched on during our first episode, to explain how mutuality and cooperation are built on transparency and agreements, and what he has to say about this war and his experience in Iran, the energy market there, the sanctions that were put in place, and then finally the dominance of the United States and the weaponization of the dollar, and how all of these factors have come to engender this crisis, this terrible attack on Ukraine, is fascinating. I'm very grateful to Chris that he made the time to speak with me such last minute. And I hope that this episode shines a light on some of the larger questions hovering over what's going on in Ukraine. If you enjoy the episode, support Planet Critical on Patreon, where you'll also get access to the transcripts of these interviews. The link is in the description box below, and thanks to everyone who's already supporting the project. Chris, I'm so grateful to have you on the show again, just a few weeks after your last episode about energy markets, because it's all kicked off. Russia's invaded Ukraine. There's all these talks of how economic sanctions are going to hurt Russia, despite the fact that we're really dependent on Russian energy. And I just thought it'd be best to have you on to clarify what's actually being proposed and if it will be any use in your experience. So, first of all, thank you for joining me again.
Well, thank you for making the contact, because, it's a subject of great interest to me and 40 years experience, really. So, where to begin?
Just before I hit record, we were talking about your experience with Iran, the energy market there, and the sanctions that were put on Iran. Can you give a little bit of history into that and what we might learn from those sanctions and how they're being applied now to Russia?
Yeah, well, my history with Iran began 20 odd years ago. My colleague and I, we put forward a proposal to Iran at the time that the Intercontinental Exchange was taking over the Petroleum Exchange. We believed that would lead to financialization of the oil markets, which it has in the last 20 years. And my friend, being Iranian, we wrote to the governor of the central bank, who he knew, in Iran, obviously. And we recommended that a Middle Eastern benchmark should be put in place.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, the global benchmark price at the moment is Brent, North Sea, has been for a long time, but the Brent field is only a small part of it now, almost vanishingly small. It's the Norwegian fields, which are the biggest ones now. And the other benchmark price is what's called West Texas Intermediate, which is a US one. And in fact, the market benchmark has sort of swung back to the US. That's a sideline. Point was, I worked on a Middle Eastern benchmark when I was at IP in the 90s, because that's where all the oil is. So it's an obvious place to have a benchmark price, Yeah. And we put this recommendation forward for a Middle East exchange. And then the phone went about 2-3 years later. And next thing I know, I'm over in Iran at the central bank making a presentation for what became known as the Iran oil bourse. So rather than have it as a Middle Eastern exchange, they wanted it as an Iranian exchange, which is fine. And it was from that, my experience of Iran I've been there a dozen times. I've seen how it's changed in the interim period of 15 to 20 years as an entire new generation has grown up. And the changes that took place have been absolutely fascinating. But more to the point, I've seen sanctions at work, and I've seen and talked to people at top level over there about the effect of them. and observed the effect of them. And there were essentially two types of sanction that were applied. One was physical sanctions. So you literally, the Iranians literally couldn't lay their hand on the goods and the goods that they wanted. They couldn't get them. Well, that backfired because they started building capacity, being smart people, and started doing it themselves. Because, of course, what they call the curse of oil is that rich nations get rich and fat and lose any sort of capacity to do the stuff themselves and bring in outside contractors to do it. They call it the resource curse, which it is. So physical sanctions just didn't work, never really have. The financial sanctions, different ball game, and the Americans got gradually developed over a period, but they were. I always say that they were tactically became quite smart, and they're getting smarter still, and we can go on to that. But they were strategically failed massively, because what happened was the Ahmadinejad regime was it was a kleptocracy. And if the Americans had done what they did everywhere else, like to Russia, and said, okay, guys, here's some bank accounts, ship your money out, Iran would have collapsed. It would have collapsed in the same way that post-Soviet Russia collapsed. If the Americans had been smart, instead of coming up with literally self-defeating sanctions, which is what they did. They were just dumb sanctions. But gradually, in more recent years, what they've done is they've personalized them. Now, that is quite smart, okay? Actually looking at the people in power, finding where their assets are, where their kids go to school, stuff like that, because that's what they all do. All the Iranian elites educated their kids in America. And so targeting them, and this is exactly what I think they're now doing or looking to do with Russia. So that's a smart sanction compared to these indiscriminate ones, which is basically about punishing the population.
Right.
And is self-defeating because it just makes them more pissed off, actually. So does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, kind of dipping into what we discussed the last time then as well. What I'm picking up on that is that it's not really in human nature to just roll over, is it? Like, if you take something away from communities and populations, they will find a resilient way to get what it is that they need. And that's what happened in Iran. And certainly we're seeing in Russia right now the queues of this population. Most of whom do not want this war. Queuing up to try and take, liquid cash out of the bank because they're terrified of what's going to happen. But we are also seeing, these attempts at personalized sanctions against the Russian oligarchs, the 25 of them that kind of run the country. So you think that will be more important than cutting Russia off from SWIFT, for example?
I think it's more effective, and certainly than cutting them off from SWIFT, which is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction.
Right.
It's very worrying what they've done. Very worrying. This weaponization of the dollar is really dangerous. Really dangerous. And again, I think that will. I mean, people have been saying, "Oh, it's going to lead to a new." There's all sorts of rubbish talked about the Chinese, as going to be the next global currency. No, it's not. Not until they completely change their policy. It won't be. People don't even tend to understand what a reserve currency even is. But everybody does want to come up, I think, with a more rational market structure. And that's the sort of thing I've been working on for a long, long time. It just isn't. For me, we're going through a sort of transition to something different. I think this event, Putin doing what he did, which frankly, I think is a big mistake, strategic mistake. But it literally is going to change the game. I mean, what the Russians have always wanted, well, for a long, long time, is a new settlement is what they've been looking for. We never really got a post-Cold War settlement. They attempted them with the Minsk Agreement and I think the Paris Charter. But I'm sorry, the Americans made a massive strategic mistake by essentially saying, okay, well, despite what we actually said we would do, we will extend NATO eastwards. And that's a strategic error by the Americans. And I think just because Putin might be paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get him, because they are out to get him. But we are where we are, Rachel. We are where we are. And we have to find a constructive way forward. And that's not particularly evident at the minute.
Absolutely. So tell me then about Europe's dependence on Russian energy.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, how dependent are we? How much of our energy do we get from them? And could we reach the stage where we sanction them economically and then they just turn off the tap and go, well,
Mm.
there you go, then no more energy for you?
Yeah, that is a risk. And then that's a risk that it's a sort of nuclear option. If we're not getting paid for it, the Russians could say, why send it? you know.
Mm,
But let's just go back a bit, Rachel,
hmm
because during the Cold War, which really was, a Cold War, it was really quite, this clash of ideologies between the West and
mm.
the East. I mean, the USSR was reliably supplying, oil and gas to the West,
Throughout
and
that.
who were reliably paying them for it.
Mm,
Okay. And it's interesting because, as a parallel to that, when Iran was at its most radical under Khomeini, guess what? They were flogging oil to Israel via Mark Rich as a middleman, right?
right.
And they were doing it quite reliably, and nobody batted an eyelid about it.
Mm,
It was only once the middlemen got in, right? When the markets got in, when the oligarchs got in, and what I call in Iran the theoligarchs got in, right? After
mm,
Khomeini died, that's when people, because if you do that, you can start dipping your bread, can't you? And
mm.
that's what they started to do. And the previous cutoff, and everybody says, oh, Putin cut off the gas. Well, actually, he wasn't being paid by Ukrainian oligarchs who were essentially taking a great big fat transit tax, which is what it was, and he got rather pissed off about it. And I can't say I blame him as a sort of supplier.
When was this, sorry?
That was about 2014 or so.
Was that before or after he annexed Crimea?
I think that I'd have to check on the dates when he actually cut off Ukraine, but it
Right.
was essentially a commercial dispute between between two oligarchies, and it also that's one of the reasons why you're looking at Nord Stream, isn't it?
Mm,
Because he decided that, well, actually, I can't. I need to diversify my supply routes. And everybody said, oh my God, we're going to be more reliant upon the Russians. Well, actually, it increases the resilience that you have if you've got more than one supply route.
right.
And it works two ways. You see, the thing is, Rachel, pipelines have two ends. It's not like you can divert a pipeline somewhere else.
Mm.
You're sort of stuck with it. And then, gas molecules flow one way and euros or dollars flow the other, so
So,
that there is a mutual dependence there.
mm, how much of our energy supply are we currently getting from Russia?
We're not getting any to speak of. Europe is getting between 30 and 40%.
Wow.
Yeah. But equally, that works two ways.
Yeah.
Most of Russia's supply and sales goes to Europe. So yeah, Germany's a big customer.
Mm,
Holland, most of the countries. We maybe get a little bit makes its way through. But it's hard to distinguish one molecule from another. They don't have
yeah.
Russian flags on them. You know.
So hang on, tell me then,
Mm,
allow me this little thought experiment,
mm,
right? Europe does its, well, the West, which it really is the West now, do their economic sanctions and try and hit
mm,
the oligarchs.
mm.
And then Putin turns the tap off and goes, right, fine, you don't get any more energy. How would he then continue financing the war, for example?
Um, well, I mean, if it's not actually difficult to print rubles and buy things in rubles,
Mm,
provided he's self-sufficient in terms of the means of production, provided he's got the metals in Russia, he's got the things he needs in Russia, well, he can print rubles to do it, you
I
know.
thought I thought the whole thing was you're not allowed to print money.
Well, no, that is the completely misconceived banking world in which we live, and that's the subject of another
Right.
session, Rachel. I'm booking a third one now. But no, I mean, the monetary system we have at the moment, you may have come across modern monetary theory, MMT,
Mhm.
for instance, which is interesting, but it's incomplete in my view. I came across it a decade ago, and it's interesting what they do. But I personally take the view that, treasuries and central banks are just so last century, that we're going to move on to more decentralized and distributed financial system. Hence, I'm at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security, because resilience is bottom up.
Mm,
And that's where the world is leading. But again, park that. Yes, they can print. What causes inflation is not printing money, it's having the resources, or rather not having the resources. Okay. You can actually print rubles and spend them in your own country and there'll be no inflation, provided the resources are there. You've got a problem if you actually need stuff from outside of Russia. So maybe parts or materials or raw materials in particular. But Russia does have a pretty
Yeah.
wide spread of materials.
Yeah.
But there are things they don't have, certain components, high-tech components and whatnot. But again, China will be only too happy to supply them with that these days. And China, the thing is that at the moment, Russia does supply a lot of gas to China, and China wants everything Russia can produce. But a lot of the fields are not connected to pipelines that go to China, right?
Right.
They're looking to actually put a pipeline in to make that possible, because at the moment, you can have a monopoly, but on the other side, you've got a monopsony. You've only got one buyer, or you've only got one seller. So it is this sort of two drunks holding each other up.
Yeah.
Europe in particular, Germany in particular, because they are a powerhouse, and France has of course got this big nuclear fleet of power. But Germany, Holland, in fact, are interesting. There's a 50% joint venture between a Russian company, Alpha, and the Dutch, and so they own gas fields in the North Sea, and they've essentially got a pot of production which they can use as like a sort of pool which they can trade with. They opened Gazprom they opened retail energy outlets, if you like. Gazprom provides business gas in the UK, has done for a good while, because there's no cap on business gas prices. There is a cap on retail gas prices.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm.
So then let me continue, and please tell me this thought experiment is completely useless. But if we may continue it, then Russia's pretty independent, arguably. Then it has access to its own energy supply. It has access to a lot of raw materials and resources, and it's got its big pal China over there that would be happy to supply whatever it's missing. Then say Putin, as a madman, were to take that step and up the ante. What would Europe's response be? I mean, could he use this energy dominance to win this war?
He could make life very uncomfortable. We're going out of winter now, but it would make life very uncomfortable for Europe. It would, not so much for us, because we've got the Norwegian gas, a lot of it. In fact, one of the jokes is we actually export gas. We don't use everything that's produced in our sector of the North Sea. And our North Sea producers are making out like bandits right now.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. If the price is massive, who's on the other side of the trade? The gas producers and the oil producers are making phenomenal amounts of money. You should see the profits that BP, Shell, and the rest of them are making.
Right.
The ones in the North Sea. And Iran actually owns gas in the North Sea. Not many people know that. They are actually providing gas to the UK. They bought it. They were very canny. They actually invested in those fields under the Shah.
Right.
So that's been around a long time, and they made some canny investments. So that gas they supply about 2.5% of UK's gas. That's when it's not being exported to somewhere else.
Right.
The whole point is that the market sends energy to the highest price, irrespective of any requirements for resilience that we have. You should see what's going on in Norway right now. It's insane. Absolutely insane what they're doing with these electricity markets. And I said 20 years ago it would end this way. It was nonsense.
So then, sorry, just to take a little detour then. Imagine if we had in place a resilient energy market based on, the research that you and your colleagues have been doing. How would that impact global security in the future? I mean, what kind of position would that put a nation like Russia in, that has so much energy, or China that has so many resources and materials?
Well, I mean, they would love it. a resilient
Oh,
market. That's what they
okay.
want. You see, at the moment, right, the Russians have supplied. People have said, "Oh, the Russians are deliberately holding back, deliveries." No, they haven't. What they've been doing is all their contract. They want as many contracts as possible to be long term.
Mm,
They want to supply on a long term basis, whereas the market is about insane day to day trading, right?
mhm.
We're setting prices day to day practically. And then we wonder why we get spikes in prices. And, well, one of the reasons, again, there's no storage. We had gas storage. You need a buffer stock in order to supply out of stock. Well, guess what? We shut it down 5 years ago or something like that because
Ah,
there was no profit in it. It's insane. It's an insane market. This is what happens when you commoditize molecules,
mm,
when you buy and sell molecules and you buy and sell electrons. And that's before we even talk about the insanity of buying and selling CO2.
mm.
Sorry, I go on a rant very easily.
My kind of rants.
But coming back to the point, which is one of your questions, what else can we do?
Mm,
What would a resilient market look like? And that has been the subject of my work for the last 10, 12 years or more. And I've got a fairly clear view of what that is. Firstly, what you don't want is to change any law, right? Because always what happens is somebody resists that.
right.
Somebody's always benefiting, and
Yeah,
the person who's losing is the one who wants to change the law, right?
yeah.
So that's what you get. You don't want to have a method whereby you need to change the law. And that means sort of mutual agreements. Now, what we're proposing, and it's the ideas are not just mine. I've been working with a friend of mine who actually is Iranian friend. He's actually in London for the first time in years, actually, and he was one of the most senior Iranian energy people. He reported directly to the OPEC representative, and he was in charge of all the Caspian oil and gas, multi-billion budgets and whatnot. Very, very intelligent, lovely man, with great integrity, which is not always the case. And going way back to there was a war in 1990 between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and we had round two actually only less than a year ago. We had the round two in that war, and it was a nasty war. It went on for about 8 years, and of course, Iran is on the border of both of those countries. And it's one thing what they did, because my friend actually suggested that this should be done, was that they supplied gas to an enclave that was isolated called Nagorno-Karabakh. And they were
Mhm.
going to freeze to death, lots of people. It was wartime, everything's destroyed, a lot of things destroyed. And Iran supplied gas to Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an enclave of Armenia. In exchange, they got spare electricity coming from a nuclear power plant in Armenia. It was an ex-Soviet era power plant with spare capacity.
Mhm.
So it was a swap. Okay. Iran did not sell its gas. This is the key point. They
Yeah.
didn't sell it in exchange for dollars and then buy electricity with dollars. What they did was they swapped it.
Mhm.
And Mahmoud did this again. I'm giving his name. And what he also arranged was for a swap. They called it the Caspian oil swap. So oil from Turkmenistan came into the north of Iran, and that oil was financed and funded by venture capitalists, oil companies, who were wondering how the hell can we get paid,
Mm.
you know. So the oil was supplied to the Tabriz refinery and swapped for a supply of a different grade of oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. And that's what I would call a geographical swap.
Right.
The other one was a swap of converting one form of energy for another. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now these are swaps of flow, and these swaps of flow can be done in addition to anything else you're doing. So there's no reason why Russia, for instance, could not supply gas into this pool of gas that sits in Europe,
Mhm.
particularly when they got this pot of, winter sold gas sitting there as well. Now that could be swapped for a supply of gas coming into the UK. All right. It's not sold, it's supplied and swapped.
Mhm.
for maybe a supply of then power in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
They could do that using swaps, and it transcends this commodity market. It's what's called over the counter, or it's an additional tool. No
Mm-hmm.
reason why it can't be done at all. You could do it tomorrow because it's a mutual agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of thing. That's the way I see it happening. These swaps, the one I wax lyrical about, because I'm really more interested, not so much in oil and gas and electricity, but how do we actually make the transition to, a new economy? That's one of your questions.
Mm.
And there are different forms of swap. The best one is the 1778 swap that James Watt did, the Scottish inventor.
Mm-hmm.
He invented a new pump, much more efficient than the old one. He didn't sell it to the Cornish tin mines, who had a water pumping problem and had a very inefficient pump. He gave them the use of it.
Yeah.
Pumping as a service in exchange for a third of the coal they saved.
Yeah.
Now, the beauty about that model, Rachel, is you're saving at the retail price, right? Whereas if you're selling, if you actually sell power, it goes in at the wholesale bid and you buy it back. So you sell for 5 pence what you buy back for 15, or now it's 25 or 30, right? Savings are made at the retail price. And I talk about smart swaps because I believe that the biggest trade of the 21st century is going to be a swap of what's between our ears, knowledge, know-how, know-who,
Mm-hmm.
a swap of that for carbon fuel savings made at the retail price and electricity made at the retail price. Does that make sense in terms of a market in essentially in services?
Yeah.
So just to conclude the sort of riff, the current market is centralized. It's got middlemen called exchanges and banks and whatnot. They're the middlemen. And it's capital intensive and it's intensive in resources. What we're going to, this smart economy, is intensive in intellectual capital, if I can call it that. And so we're seeing a complete paradigm shift going on right now, I believe. And I think it will take place much more quickly than people think.
See, you had me convinced during our last interview about, Market 3.0, this idea of network.
This is a good example of it.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing to me, the question that comes up then would be, well, can these resilient markets promote global stability and peace?
Mm-hmm.
And then how could these resilient markets function during times of war?
Well, what I'm saying is, I mean, what Mahmoud or the Iranians called what they did, they called it energy for peace, right? They called it energy for peace. And, what is it Putin's looking for? He wants stable, long-term supply agreements. He says so. What he didn't want to do and what they haven't been doing is selling gas on the open market because it's volatile. Now, if you think about it, Rachel, I mean, I think I mentioned this before. The supplier, the producer wants stable, high price, transparent markets, and the buyer wants stable, low price, transparent markets. But the middleman, stability and transparency are death. They don't make money that way. So what we're talking about, back to the last session I had, cutting out the middleman requires this combination of swaps on the one hand and literally monetizing energy on the other, with this very simple idea of, here's a voucher that you can use to pay your electricity bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
A token, if you like, but not a blockchain or a token in that sense. It's a promise or an IOU. Think of it as an IOU.
Mm-hmm. Would that then improve intergovernmental relationships if they were swapping rather than trading through middlemen?
Yes, because I think so. Because first of all, they have to be transparent to do it. That's one thing. Secondly, the interesting thing about these energy credits is they've got names on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dollar bills don't have names on them. Okay.
No, I see.
So if you're into sort of, and a lot of people are into sort of, corruption, things like this. I mean, it's the norm in many countries. We just do it in a much more subtle way.
Yeah.
but we're involved in it nonetheless.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
there's somebody I know said many years ago, he said, the difference between electronic cash and electronic money is electronic money knows who owns it,
Hmm.
right? And that's exactly the point. There would be a level of transparency here because what we're talking about, Rachel, is a prepayment. That's
Mhm.
what a voucher is. It's prepayment. And if you sell forward a lot of your production in this way and you get prepaid for it, what is the risk to the buyer? Well, the risk is that you don't actually have the supply that he's paid you for, right?
Mm.
So it has to be transparent. Otherwise, it's not going to work, but transparency is not enough. You also need what I would call quality control, which if you go back 1,000 years, that was what the mint did. The mint,
Mhm.
the mint was quality control. You would
Mhm.
take bullion to the mint, they would assay it, they would coin it, and they would issue it. But it
Mhm.
wasn't the mint's coin. They were just the quality control mechanism. And I think we'll see that reinvented in modern form, Rachel. I do.
Mhm.
You could see imagine an energy treasury. I write
Yeah.
about that, and a mint, and an exchequer, which is a shared ledger is an exchequer. That's what it was.
Public ledger.
Exactly. Shared
Mm.
public ledger.
Like the
Absolutely.
blockchain.
Well, the blockchain, the trouble with that is it's a collective and it's replicated at
Mhm.
vast expense of energy. What
Yes.
what I invented in 1998 was a shared market ledger, basically shared registration. Um, and there the uniqueness, because one you had to have thing about the blockchain is it meant you couldn't do double spending, nor could you in what I invented back then,
Mhm.
because you had it in unique time order,
Mhm.
right? It would be registered in unique time order. The difference is that the blockchain is what I would call synchronous.
Mhm.
It's all registered at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
What I'm proposing is that it's asynchronous and it's just registered in unique time order. But by doing that, and what I did predated the blockchain by 10 years, and basically exchanges use it in a proprietary form, it just works and
Mm.
it is unique. So from that point of view, the blockchain and coins, what they actually did, Rachel, which is, I think, a game changer, they literally demonstrated that debt, equity, derivatives are not the only forms of instrument out there. The coins may have subjective value, but they're not the old system.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm saying is prepayment also has objective value. And
Mhm.
it was there before debt, equity, and derivatives even existed. But I'm sure
Yeah.
I riffed about this last time we spoke.
Well, let's get back to Russia and this energy question. I mean, do you think it's likely that Putin will, use that question of it? Do you think it's likely he'll turn the taps off, or that he'll up the ante in that way?
I think if the West continues with its chosen path, he might say sod it.
Mm,
Why not? What difference does it make?
yeah.
That
What
is the risk. Mm.
what do you think would be a better strategy from the West to de-escalate the conflict?
Well,
And also put him in his place. I mean, it is shocking
mm,
what he's done, invading a
completely,
sovereign country.
completely,
Mm.
absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And there's a large degree on one side of the argument about whataboutery.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
what
yeah,
about what the
yeah,
Americans did? Blah, blah,
yeah,
blah, blah.
yeah,
That doesn't excuse what he's done. What he's done
yeah,
is absolutely wrong.
yeah.
And in my view, well, I mean, I'm I'm not sure that I don't think he's quite the dictator that people think he is. I put it this way: there are people in Russia who could come together and say, right, that's enough.
Yeah. Okay.
And I have a feeling that that might be what happens. That they really are quite. You might not think this, but they are holding back quite a bit in Ukraine. Ukraine does have an interest in making the most of what is happening, and every death is a tragedy. I mean, don't get me wrong. Again, I'm not excusing anything that's going on there
Mhm.
at all. But there are two sides to every coin, and I think there's a huge reluctance. Don't forget, it's mainly a conscript army Russia has got. They're people who talk the same language. Body bags starting going home is not good. I mean,
Yeah.
Christ, they got mobile crematoria and all the rest of it, is what I've
Yeah.
heard. But I don't know if that's apocryphal to me. But yeah, I mean, what's the end game here? Well, I do think the only settlement has to be a whole, a whole system has to be, like the Minsk Agreement attempted to be and the Paris Charter attempted to be. But the US, like with the Bretton Woods Agreement, they had it their own way, right? And they're probably saying, well, okay, we can weaponize the dollar and the dollar's going to be there forever. I don't think so.
Yeah.
And I think also people underestimate the influence of China.
Mm-hmm.
China, it did make some sort of intervention not that long ago. And I think Putin basically, don't forget, his only access to goods and services is coming via that Chinese pipeline if he shuts this one down,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't want to have the Chinese as my only buyer. They're pretty
No.
ruthless, right?
Yeah, no.
They're pretty ruthless. I would like to have an alternative buyer if I had Chinese buyers. You see the point?
But then couldn't that be quite a good move strategically for the West? It hasn't the great fear been that there's these two big, powerful nations,
Mm,
China being the alpha dog, but Russia being a big threat nonetheless. But
mm.
if Russia has to cow to China in that sense, don't you kind of then minimize one of those risks?
Yeah, you sort of do, but it's not stable.
Yeah, true.
It's not stable. What currency do they settle in? Well, the Chinese, in one way, they settle in yuan, in the other, they settle in rubles.
Mm,
But they still maybe they still probably price in dollars implicitly.
mm,
It's not sustainable. A new global means of exchange and clearing system is needed. The dollar is not it. And we've seen how much the dollar is not it. The Chinese must be literally crapping themselves in terms of where do we put our money now if the Americans can grab every last cent we've got,
right. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is what's happening here,
Yeah.
and I think some of what America's just been doing, and look at what they did with the Afghans. Oh, thank you very much. We're going to have that money. We're going to give it to people for 9/11.
Yeah.
Well, hello, 9/11 wasn't down to the bloody Afghans. It was down to the Saudis,
Yeah.
or Saudi people anyway on that plane, etc., etc., etc.
Hmm.
No, you can't, you cannot, it's not sustainable the way it is. And I think that's why it's sort of end of an era stuff. There needs to be, a call it a Bretton Woods Mark II or whatever you like to call it, but there has to be a new settlement.
Oh, that's interesting. So maybe the United States of America is overplaying its hand here, flexing too
Mm,
many muscles that are making it actually weak because people just won't accept it anymore.
yeah, I think so. I think that's the way it's going. I mean, there are wise heads there, many wise heads in the US, but there's always this American exceptionalism has been sitting around for a long, long time. If you go back to Bush and when they attacked Iraq, and it was all going to be very difficult. But guess what? It was all over in weeks. And the Americans then could have come up with a new settlement. But oh no, the neocons, real men go to Tehran. That's what they were saying. That was a moment that was lost.
Right.
But I think we've now reached a point at which people have got rather tired of all the killing and whatnot. No, I really do think so. There's a big change needed, and it has to be holistic. And the markets are part of it, and the payments are part of it.
I mean, it also sounds like we discussed this before. We discussed,
Mm,
equity and through that equality. But it also sounds like, if you want to create a markets 3.0 where there's a sense of swaps and you're getting rid of
mm,
middlemen and you're
mm,
accounting for transparency, I mean, it also then means that there is no space in the world for a top dog regime
mm.
like the United States.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to hear this because you see a lot of stuff on Twitter, especially the minute that this war kicked off. There's a certain section of leftists that like to
Mm,
say, well, it's because the West did this and US has a history of doing X and, they're
mhm.
domineering. No, 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 no. Don't think that was the moment. But nonetheless, what you're clarifying is that the market systems that are currently in place are kind of supported by and engender that dominance of the United States.
Mhm.
And I wonder if that's causing this amount of friction for nations like Russia and China. But then would it not happen that that would just create a power vacuum and one of these other nations would step in and take
Well,
top position?
I think that the key to it is this word about its dominance.
Mm.
The Americans have this doctrine they introduced in 1st of July 2017. It was intriguing under Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it was it was introduced by a Democrat, Gary Cohn, and Rex Tillerson, who is like, he is a Republican, but he's not exactly a Trump Republican.
Mm.
And I thought at the time, what the hell are they doing in a Trump administration? And I couldn't work out what they were doing until I saw that happen, this energy dominance doctrine. Because at that moment, what they then did, the Saudis stopped pricing oil on the 1st of July 2017 when they brought this new doctrine in. They stopped pricing oil against a formula which is based on Brent called B-Wave, Brent weighted average, which they've been doing for 16 years under the Intercontinental Exchange.
Mm.
Do you know who founded the Intercontinental Exchange? Gary Cohn.
Right.
Gary Cohn of Goldman and John Shapiro of Morgan Stanley sat down for dinner one day and came up with a fantastic strategy and implemented it. And they literally financialized the oil market. But that paradigm changed at that point into energy dominance, because of what essentially that meant was the Brent benchmark has over the last 2 or 3 years essentially given way. So that it used to be the Brent dog wagged the WTI tail for a long, long time. But now WTI is sort of the new one. And even that's changing. And I could wax lyrical about, market technicalities, but I won't. But the point is, the Americans dominate the oil market. And my thesis is, and this is pure speculation because you never prove it, but I'm 99% sure that they have linked the dollar to oil. Okay, they've linked it.
What does that mean?
Well, literally, it's like an energy standard. It's an oil standard that they've essentially fixed it. So the dollar and the oil price are linked. It's called a peg, I believe so. It's within certain boundaries, Rachel. So it might be between certain, maybe plus or minus 5% of a particular target rate.
Yeah.
But what they've also done, and this is not a new strategy, one of your questions I'm just looking at here is, why did the price of oil break $100 per barrel once Russia invaded? Well, the reason is it had reached $90 before it did. And it had no business being at $90, right? If you go back only 3 months, it was $65.
God.
And what we saw was a massive flow of funds coming into the market, nothing to do with physical oil prices at all, right? The physical oil market had nothing to do with it. This is financial purchases. I don't know if I gave you an example previously, but it's such a good one. Between mid-2007, the price was $80. By July of 2008, it reached $147, and people say it could do that again.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Within 5 months in 2008, it was $35. And by the middle of 2009, it was $80 again. So it went 80, 147, 35, 80 in 2 years. During that time, Rachel, do you know how much the actual physical supply changed?
I've no idea.
Less than 3%. Now yes, less than 3%. But Rachel, that's not a market. That's a casino. No. That is an absolute casino.
Yes.
And it's a casino that I like to say, 6 zeros and a crooked croupier, right? Yeah. That's how bad that was and is. You see, commodity market 101. If a producer can support prices, if he can, he will. And he can do so for decades. Like the tin market from the Second World War all the way to 1985 was supported by a cartel of producers.
Right.
The other markets did the same. Coffee, cocoa, they all tried to, in order to support the price, you have to have a means of storing inventory. right? You've got to keep product off the market, like De Beers with diamonds, same thing.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that case study.
Well, classic case. That was
Yeah.
like a monopoly.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's what happened until eventually in 1995, I started in regulation the year after. Cheap material came in, the producer cartel ran out of money, and the price went from $8,000 a ton to $4,000 a ton overnight.
Wow.
You know, and I believe that that's what's been happening in the oil market. That I call it macro manipulation, which can go on for decades. The copper market was manipulated by Sumitomo for 10 years, and that, in my view, is what's been going on here.
How? Sorry, because they're holding inventory?
Well, in this case, it was Enron to blame. Enron came up with a new technique of funding things called prepayment, right?
Right.
But it was done invisibly. I advocate prepayment as a means of funding things, but it has to be invisibly. Enron did it invisibly so that 70% of their funding, the underlying business, never existed. You know, it's a fascinating case study of it was a fraud, and people went to prison for long terms because of it. But that opaque prepayment, it enabled oil to be funded invisibly to the market. And Isabella Kaminska, she invented the expression dark inventory, which is inventory which appears to be in somebody's ownership, but somebody else has prepaid. And that's not visible. I'm absolutely sure it's no accident that ICE came along after Enron died, because that technique has created essentially a false market in oil, where there are people in the know as to where this dark inventory is, and people who don't know, which is mostly everybody else. And the market has evolved over the last 2 decades. You know, different people have been involved, things have happened, etc., etc. But those techniques are what have made this market it needs to be reconfigured immediately. I gave evidence to the Treasury Select Committee in July of 2008. Okay. And I said then that we had to have what the market was doing, and we had to have some sort of transatlantic regulation of it. Did we get it? No. But it's just not sustainable anymore. It's just become, we just need to have a different, I talk about a global clearing system, energy clearing system, some sort of mutual agreement. You may know from your history that at Bretton Woods, Keynes came up with the idea for a clearing union. He called it the Bancor. It was a different model to the one that the Americans imposed. But that's an interesting piece of economic history. But it is achievable. Mutual global agreements are achievable. And I think that's the way that we're going to have to go.
And that would impact the relationships between nations, between governments. And I mean, I just think it seems harder to imagine going, invading a nation, your neighbor, if you have these mutual transparent agreements set up.
Absolutely. And not just that, there's a bigger opportunity, and that is, think how much money and talent is being wasted on increasingly baroque weaponry and aircraft carriers with no enemy, and no purpose other than to make profit for, pretty indefensible businesses. When I was last in Moscow, and I've only been there twice, I was at a show, and there were weapons manufacturers there who were making presentations in relation to renewable energy systems, because those guys have the expertise in engineering, but you could say it's a sort of swords to plowshares, I think, which is needed here, Rachel. All of that talent, if it's put to the sort of smart swap that I talk about, that I think is what needs to change. But that will take a sea change in attitude, and we have to get there from here, which will mean, baby steps, because we have to build trust, because at the moment there isn't any. Far from it. It's the opposite.
Yeah, which is part of this key problem of even beginning thinking about peace talks over in that part of the world at the moment. I have one final question, and that is that this invasion has been used as a reason as to why we need to transition away from fossil fuels
Mm.
because of, for example, Europe's dependency on Russia, and transition to renewables. Is that possible? Is that likely? What would what would that look like? Is the market ready for it? Is it a real solution to a bigger problem, or is it just sort of people jumping on a bandwagon for a different cause right now?
Well, you're talking about some people who said that, but the usual suspects are saying the opposite. They're saying this proves the need for more fracking. This proves the need for everything. So
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
are saying you are correctly saying what one constituency
yeah,
is saying, but there's another one who I think are probably in the ascendant at the moment.
yeah,
Well, let's go back on all this stupid greenwash. All of that. You can hear them, can't you?
yeah.
What we have to do, I think, is to come up with a sort of a balance.
Hmm.
You know, I'm into mutuality and cooperation, and that fundamental point of would you rather have 100% of nothing or a smaller percentage of something?
Yeah,
That's what it comes down to.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think this concept of mutuality is so interesting because I think in today's sort of paradigm,
Mm,
the concept of resilience is sort of like individual
mm,
strength.
mm,
So on a geopolitical level, it's like if a nation could
mm,
survive by itself, if that nation
mm,
could fight, or if it had access to resources or whatever. And it just requires such an imagination to stretch that out to resilience is actually cooperation,
mm,
and then the fantastic impact that that would have geopolitically and on our markets and on people's well-being.
mm,
It's at first exciting, but also it's quite saddening to because it's such a stretch of the imagination. You realize just sort of how far behind we are
mm.
really in dealing with these questions.
And yet, Rachel, the future is already here. One of the pieces of the global plumbing that's been sitting there for 150 years, I mentioned it before, I think, is the Protection and Indemnity Club, where ship owners have been clubbing together for 150 years to insure risks that the private sector won't take.
Yeah.
And a lot of the ship owning industry are not nice people. You know, some of them are, but you can imagine that some of them most definitely are, you know, pretty ruthless.
Mm,
And yet it is in their self-interest to club together to mutual benefit to minimize losses. And I think that mutual risk sharing is crucial to the markets of the future. That mutual acceptance of each other's credits, mutual acceptance of and assurance of risk. I'm convinced that is the framework within which we can make a progress. Whether it's in the gas market, and I've always said CH4 is CH4 is CH4,
mm,
and instead of oil being priced in the dollar and gas being priced against oil, which is bonkers, why don't we just say, well, okay, why don't we just have the dollar and oil priced against gas?
mm. Yeah,
Because gas is the same everywhere.
yeah.
CH4. Except we're talking not so much CH4, Rachel, as the thermal MMBTU. So that is the potential for a sort of transitional mechanism, a sort of gas clearing union. And my friend Mahmoud and I, we put this forward 10 years ago in Tehran.
Hmm.
Yeah. But
And
nobody was listening.
people might be listening now.
I hope so.
Um,
Tune in to the podcast and you'll
yeah.
hear it.
Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, a pleasure, Rachel. Oh, no, a pleasure.
If you want to learn more about Chris's work on building resilient markets, I've put links to his work in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it and want access to the interview transcripts, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. A huge thank you to the Planet Critical patrons and community. This work just wouldn't be happening without you. Thank you all for listening. I hope this was valuable. I'll see you next week.